Then you can go to nursery. I promise. So actually, here's what we're going to do. You're going to help me do the children. They're going to be the kids. And you're going to be my assistant. Okay? All right. This is what happens when your mom's the pastor. So we're going to have them play a game with us. And I'm going to need you to help me. So here's the game. I'm going to show you, or Lola's going to show you pictures of places. And I want you to shout out what you can get at these places, okay? Ready? So, show them that one.
French fries.
I love that most of you are like, French fries! All right. How about this one? What do you get here?
Blizzard.
There you go. They're pretty good. Okay, what do you think? Think we'll be able to do that one? Okay. Did you get to see that one over there? This is everything. All right. How about
Hold
here?
it up higher.
Hold it up real nice and high. Friendship.
You can show the people over here more they can see it.
Lola, how about over here? Is that? You know, I think that's someplace that we can find relationships. What do you think? Like relationships with God and with people? And that's pretty important. Do you know what I was sitting here thinking to myself just now, Lola? And then I'm going to give you this. And this is going to be an activity. And you can even take one to Devin. Still want one too. There's a treat in there for you. Don't tell me. There's an extra treat for whoever's here. I was just sitting here thinking, do you know that you know, it's moments like this that you think to yourself, who raised this kid? You know, I do think that church is a place where you can get relationships. And I think the most important relationship we can have is with God, with Jesus. Do you know what really impresses me, Lola? Do you know that your grandma and grandpa, that they love Jesus? And do you know that their mommy and daddy, that they love Jesus? And that their mommy and daddy, that they love Jesus? Do you know how we can tell that? Right. Because for a family reunion, we have family who comes to church. And not every family has that. Not every family gets to have people in their life that generations and generations and generations all know Jesus. And so going to church is going to be the most important thing that you can do in your life, sweetheart. Because the family that we have that knows Jesus, everybody else, that they become like our family. And we're all going to get to be in heaven together. And we have that special blessing of knowing that we get to be there with generations of our family who all still love Jesus. Let's pray. God, I thank you for the faith of each member here. Lord, whether they be the first generation that knew you, or whether, like in our family, our faith has been passed down for generations. I thank you, Lord, that no matter when we come in, that we're welcome into your family, that we're all your sons and daughters, and brothers and sisters, Lord, among one another, and that we get the most important relationships, Lord, here. And so I thank you for this time, and I thank you for Lola, Lord, who gets to see that firsthand, who gets to see what happens when generations of family believe in you, that we can have hope in difficult times, and that we can have a deep love no matter what. And I pray, Lord, that each family here would be, even if it's just the start start the future generations moving as well. I ask this in your precious name. Amen. So if you would like to, you can go play in the nursery now, okay? All right. Wait, don't forget Belle. Well, I just preached. And I'm going to keep going. Oh. So we are second week into our new sermon series here called Finding North. And the sermon series that we're in the middle of is one where what we're doing is we're trying to establish and recreate a vision for the church. And so over last week, we began the process by asking the question together, who is it that we are serving, or who is it that we are called to serve? And so we talked about that a little bit during the message, and then afterwards we have Sunday school, and we're actually developing the vision in Sunday school together. And so we started with asking that question, and we spent some time thinking about it and beginning to narrow it down. So this week we're going to build upon that foundation, and it's going to start with this idea of that God and our neighbors are really essential pieces of what it means to be part of the family of God. And you're going to be shocked with where we're going to start to have that idea, because I think most of us think we're going to jump right into the Matthew passage, right? It's the Matthew passage where Jesus says, what is the greatest commandment? We all go, I know this one. It's love God and love your neighbors. But actually, I'm going to start much, much, much more long ago than that. And so I want to invite you to turn with me in your, are there pew Bibles? Did you get Bibles? If you got a Bible, to Exodus 20. Exodus 20 is found on page 58 in the Bibles here. We're going to start with the Ten Commandments. Probably not where you necessarily thought about starting when it comes to having a conversation about loving God and loving your neighbor. Most of us think about the Ten Commandments like 10 laws, right? There are 10 laws with a list of shoulds and should-nots. But here's an interesting fact for you as you turn to Exodus 20. If we look at the style of writing of Exodus, the style of writing in Exodus 20 is actually more like what the ancient treaties were written like, and not like ancient laws. So that means that the way that we think about the Ten Commandments being written and the way that they're being talked about are probably less like laws and more like guidelines. So if you're taking notes today, if you're following along in your notes, it's the Ten Commandments are written in the literary form similar to the treaties, not the laws of the day. As such, the early Hebrews or Israelites likely would have read the commandments more like a guide for a relationship. And that's really different for a lot of us, right? I bet a lot of us were raised with the law idea, right? You do it, you don't do it. It's the smack on the hand by God. This is that list of things that is like, no matter what else happens, this is what we don't do. So I'm going to invite you to do something with me today. What if I'm right? What if I'm right and the Ten Commandments aren't a list of laws, but a list of guidelines? Now, you don't have to come out of here and agree with me, but I want to invite you for the next 20 minutes to wonder if that's right. And if you want to disagree with me later, you are welcome to do that. But just try it on for the next 20 minutes, and let's see what happens, okay? So I'm going to start reading the Ten Commandments. And we're going to start with 1 through 5 here. So Exodus 20, the bottom of the page 58. Then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water underneath the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the third and fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath day for the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident of your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and the sea, and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. Now here's what I learned this week about those first 5 commandments. The first 5 commandments, if you notice, have everything to do with our relationship with God. So the first 5 commandments are all written this way. So what if it's not a law? What if God is laying down a guideline for our relationship? I think if he is, I think we can summarize those 5 into 3 key ideas that we can walk away with. One is, be faithful to God alone. That those guidelines tell us you need to be faithful and it needs to be to God alone. 2 is, don't use your relationship with God to your own advantage. Now, some of us have oftentimes thought that there's that little thing, you know, when you stub your toe and you use the Lord's name. And that tends to be the way that we think about that commandment, right? You stub your toe and you use the Lord's name. We say, don't use the Lord's name in vain. The concept really is that. That's really why it was written. Was that people during that time period would use the gods to say, I'm going to do this in the name of, and it was supposed to invoke more power to what you're saying. So I'm not suggesting that it's okay, and that I'm just saying it may not be what the law necessarily had an idea with for you. So for those of you who it accidentally slips out the next time you stub your toe or do whatever else, you may be good to go. But again, just try the idea on. You don't have to agree with it. And then that last part is worshiping God. So I think that those are the 3 guidelines that those first 5 commandments lay down for us in that relationship with God. So I bet you're probably already wondering it. So the last 5 commandments, I think, lay down the guidelines for our relationship with one another. So let's take a look at those. Starting from verse 12. Honor your father and mother, so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God has given you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witnesses against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or male or female slave, or ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. So here's an interesting fact about the culture during the day. A lot of us come from cultures where we see people as individuals. Some of you may not. Some of you may say, you don't understand, that's just the way my family was raised. But we tend to live in a culture that's very individualistic. So I can look at Linda, and if Linda's grown sons make a decision, I don't look at Linda and go, because what is she going to say to me? He's an adult. He's making his own choices. That's the way that we see things, right? That wasn't the culture that these people lived in. The people lived in a culture that was focused on families. Your identity was your family. Now this weekend, Rices, we may have felt that way, and we definitely speak that way sometimes, but that isn't necessarily the way that we see things. So it was common practice to have to prohibit specific behavior. That a family would say, this is what we do and this is what we don't do. Because if you do this, you bring a bad name on our whole family and our whole clan. So this is how we live here. Now we still kind of do that, don't we? Mm-hmm. But imagine an entire culture that said that. That was exactly how that was. So that was pretty common. So the 10 Commandments, to me, are God laying down the guidelines and saying, you're my family. You can have specific ways that you want to live, but this is what I'm telling you it means to be my family. This is how I want you to live, because as my family here, this is going to make it so that you're different from everybody else around you. And this is what's going to make it so that you have a greater impact in the world, is to not do these things. So these are the guidelines I'm laying out for you about what that means. So again, there's this idea of a guideline that it's probably begins, for me, it made me go, wait a minute. That is exactly what Jesus says when he talks about the greatest commandment. And so let's go ahead and turn there now. So the greatest commandment is found in Matthew 22. We're going to begin with verses 34 right through 36. So just in case you're doing notes this morning, I don't know that I made that clear. The remainder of the 5 commandments are guidelines for the community. An individual's identity was found within the group, so it was typical to prohibit anything that would jeopardize the whole community. And now this famous passage from Matthew 22. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, typical, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? Well, you know I got to do it. You know I got to tell you a bit about Jesus' culture, don't you? So this is actually a very typical question. The teachers of the day, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, this was a common question. Now think about what we talked about. We're going to look back quickly. We have Exodus, we have the 10 laws. And one scholar says every other law written after that is based on these kind of 10 laws. They're the basis of everything else. And so after that point, do you remember how many laws they added? About 600 more. Now by Jesus' day, this was new to me. I didn't know this, so we can all learn together. By Jesus' day, the teachers had started going like this. We can't follow 600 laws. Can you believe that? Amazing thought! And so here's what they started doing. They started going, well, no. God doesn't actually expect you to follow 600 laws. So they started separating them into 2 categories. Heavy laws and light laws. I didn't make the name. Heavy laws were one that it was like, you can't get around it. You have to do this, okay? So no matter what happens, this is it. And the light laws were the ones that were like the speed limit. 75, 80. You're in my family, my dad won't double the speed limit, which was great when we moved to Michigan. They were light laws. Those were the ones that were like, well, God said it, but if you break it, there's not going to be that big of a deal. And that's kind of the difference. So you can imagine then that they had tons of conversations. The teachers started having tons of conversations about how they were going to categorize laws. So the categorization and seeing if you could summarize them became this huge topic of discussion for everybody. Now, think back to this scene. What's the very first line that we hear? Jesus had just shut down the Sadducees. Now, the Sadducees and the Pharisees had an interesting kind of relationship. They both believed different things. And so in Jesus' day, they kind of went at one another. And so what happened was the Pharisees were watching as Jesus was picking on the Sadducees, and they were like, dang, woo! And then they're like, hey, Jesus, we're just wondering if you agree with us. really what's going on here. That's what the testing is about. Do you agree with us? And that's why they go over. They're like, Jesus, summarize the commandments for us. Let's see if he agrees with us, guys. Jesus picks out the greatest commandments. And he connects them with a common Jewish phrase, which is our title for today, and you shall love. So let's read that, the commandments that he says are the greatest. And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. I love it when I read commentaries and they say things and I go, oh, I never knew that. Or, ooh, I don't know what I think about that. Here's what I learned about this. Jesus may not have been the first person to put these two commandments together. Remember, I'm asking you to try things on today. You don't have to believe me. But just for the next 2 minutes, wonder with me. Well, if Jesus, though, wasn't the first person to put those together, and to me, I went, well, that makes sense. If I start reading the 10 Commandments as though they're really categorized in love God and love others, then yeah, it probably made sense that idea had kind of trickled down. But then here's my question. What makes that saying so great? What makes it so impressive that the author of Matthew said, I got to write that down? And here's where we bring it all in today. What makes it so great is not that Jesus said it, but that Jesus lived it. You see, ever since the 10 Commandments, the Jewish people had lots of laws, and they struggled to live according to them. Even if you narrowed them down to 2. Even if you narrowed it down to love God and love others, they still struggled with it. In fact, Matthew 23, 1-3 says this. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore, do whatever they teach you and follow it. But do not do as they do. I'm preaching here. Therefore, do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they teach. What makes Jesus' words so powerful isn't whether or not he said, love God and love your neighbor. Jesus lived it out. Jesus lived it out. He lived it out. Even on the cross, he loved God. He didn't say, oh God, I forsake you. He said, oh God, why have you forsaken me? He still believed. He still had that relationship on the cross. On the cross, Jesus prayed and loved those at his feet, crying out, crucify me. You know, the problem is that most of us live lives where we make wonderful guidelines and we can't live up to them. And we don't live up to them. And we make excuses for why we can't. I know it says love God and love your neighbor, but I don't think Jesus could have possibly really meant that. So I'm going to love God and like my neighbor the best I can, depending on my mood. We laugh and go, it's true. Or it's we cut holes in the idea based on however it is we do feel. I don't think, I can't do that, so I'm just going to give up on it. And that's what we do to the guidelines that God laid out for us. And that's what we do to our own guidelines. And so today, we're going to continue the process as a congregation of writing a vision statement. And I want to invite you, as those who will stay and do that, here are my words to you. We can have a great vision statement. It can be beautiful and well thought out. It can be well crafted by Elaine, who writes greeting cards. And we can have the most beautiful words put up on the wall because she can do it. But if we don't live it out, if we don't live out whatever our vision statement is, then that's all they are, is pretty words. I have a lot of family here today. And even if they do choose to participate, they can get out of it. And so for any of the rest of you visiting, good job. You unfortunately came on a day when I'm going to preach and I'm going to have to make it fit to a whole group of people. So for the rest of you who aren't going to stay and who aren't going to be part of the process, you still have guidelines for your life. You still have ways that you say, I'm going to live this way. And I want to invite you to do the same thing. Don't make guidelines and then break them. It's hard. It's hard to love God and love others. It's hard to stick to it. The good news is we have grace. Because we're not going to do anything perfectly. But I think sometimes I let myself off the hook. Because I know I have grace. Instead of digging in and saying, it's going to be really hard to love you right now. It's going to be really hard to like you right now. It's going to be really hard to live by this guideline, but I'm going to do it. And that's when I invite us to think about Jesus again. And think about Jesus living on that cross and doing it even when it was hard. Will you pray with me? Gracious Lord God, Lord, you who are our Father who created us, our Father who brings us into your family, who makes us one of your own, who saves us, Lord, and who even gives us guidelines or laws, Lord, to follow, to show us what it means to love you and love others. I thank you, Lord Jesus, for not just showing us in words, but showing us in actions what it means to do that even when it's hard. And I pray, Lord, that your Spirit would fill us, that you would give us the strength to do just that when it was hard. And that your Spirit, Lord, would be our comforter, would we stop and we say, I know I could have done that better. And that, Lord, this process, this journey of life that we're on, that you would walk with us as we move closer and closer to what your vision of not just who we are as a church, but who we are, Lord, as even individuals. As we walk on that journey with you. And you show us what it means to walk in your light. We ask these things in your most precious name.